part 3 of my Richard Gage Blueprint for Truth Rebuttal, we'll talk about the fact that the World Trade Center buildings were the first of their kind ever to collapse. And yes, Richard Gage, the 2004 NIST report, and I all agree that as of 2004, there is no history of destruction by fire in steel frame high-rises. So Richard Gage asks, if there had never been a tall steel frame building brought down by fire, why on September 11th were there 3 such buildings brought down, all for the first time? It's an excellent question, and it deserves a serious answer. Richard's answer is clear and simple. Steel frame buildings can't be brought down by regular fires, so this is a strong piece of evidence for controlled demolition using 4,500-degree thermites. I already discussed the likely collapse sequence of the Twin Towers in part 1 of this video, so now let's see if Richard's assertion is true. To hammer in his point, Richard shows many burning tall steel frame buildings that didn't collapse, but he doesn't acknowledge some important differences between those buildings and the Twin Towers, and his assertion that steel frame buildings with fireproofing are indestructible is simply false. There are other important firsts that day. There has never been a tall building where a large jet with 98,500 liters of exploding fuel hit at over 500 miles an hour, creating massive fires where softened steel has to hold up 180 million pounds above it. And the Twin Towers dispense with heavy concrete reinforcement and use spray-on fire retardant instead. The 3 World Trade Center buildings are no longer the only tall steel buildings to collapse in a fire. On the morning of May 13, 2008, a fire that started in a coffee vending machine on the 6th floor of the 13-story high Faculty of Architecture building at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands had a fast, all at once, almost symmetrical collapse pretty much straight into its own footprint. Most of the fire was out in the building at the collapse point. The 6-story undamaged portion was not able to stop the collapse. The tower lost all of its support almost instantaneously, most of the way around the building. Richard Gage says this is impossible, but it is not. Completed in 1970, the building was a reinforced concrete and steel structure with a 13-story tower located above several 3-story sections. Watch the blackened rectangle where the fire damage is the worst. It collapsed as a separate unit from the staircase to its right, which resisted the fire. Firefighters called it a medium fire at first, but it heated up to 1,800 degrees, and 7 hours after it began, the entire tower section collapsed instantly. Structural engineers have long asserted that the Twin Towers in Building 7 collapsed in much the same way, and have explained how in the many papers that I have read. Richard Gage's researchers will no doubt come up with ways that this collapse was different from the Twin Towers. In fact, I had 3 videos of this collapse to choose from, and I purposely chose the one that showed the ways that the collapse was not perfectly symmetrical. You can see that parts of the back fell a few moments after the rest of the building. Some of the lower floors clung to the stairway near the bottom right where the burning wasn't quite as bad. There's another video where you can't see those details, but I'm showing this one so that I can be the first to tell you that this was not a perfectly symmetrical freefall collapse. Don't let anyone obscure the ways that this collapse exposes most of the claims of controlled demolition as false. This video destroys Gage's assertions that natural fires create asymmetrical collapses from the irregular column support, that steel frame structures would stop a collapse in its tracks, that a tall steel frame building can't collapse without explosives, that the buildings would topple to the side, that there's not enough kinetic energy in a gravitational collapse to overcome the strength of a steel frame building, that fires can't weaken steel enough to cause a collapse, etc., etc., etc. Remember this video every time Richard Gage or anyone else makes any such assertion. The 9/11 Truth community has been saying, what about Building 7? And I'll answer that soon, but my question will always be, what about Delft? Remember this video anytime Richard Gage shows you a video of a tall burning steel frame building that doesn't collapse. It's true, most of them don't, but this one did. It was a natural collapse and it fell straight down and it fell fast. So now let's look at how a steel frame building can collapse from fire. Steel has a high melting point of 2,750 degrees, a lot hotter than regular fires, which get up to 1,800 or maybe 2,000 degrees. Because steel begins to lose its structural strength starting at around 750 degrees, these steel structures have traditionally been reinforced with concrete and surrounded by chemically inert gypsum fire barriers. The World Trade Center towers dispensed with the heavy concrete because its weight would have made a 110-story skyscraper with large open office spaces unsupportable. Instead, the buildings used a spray-on fire retardant, another reason why the Twin Towers may have had less ability to resist the fires. And other steel frame structures besides the skyscrapers do collapse from fire. In 1997, the large Sound Theater in Pennsylvania with steel structure collapsed. In 1967, the very large steel-framed McCormick Center in Chicago collapsed in 30 minutes. 3 4-story high steel-frame buildings at the Cadell Toy Factory in Singapore collapsed in 1997. Another prominent example is the Mumbai High North Oil Platform, constructed of steel and 7 stories high, which completely collapsed after burning for 2 hours. The Interstate 580 overpass near San Francisco, supported only by steel beams, suffered no impact but collapsed due to the heat of a gasoline fire after 19 minutes. The Sofa Superstore collapsed in Charleston, South Carolina, killed 9 firefighters, and word spread rapidly through the firefighter community. Long-span trusses supported that roof. World Trade Center 5 had a partial collapse of 4 floors on 9/11. Surely this wasn't caused by a few thermites left only in the part of the building that had collapsed, the part that burned the most. Steel frame buildings are not impervious to partial or total collapse. The ideal of the indestructibility of a steel frame building goes back to the era of the unsinkable ship Titanic. In 1900, the Post and McCord building, quote, was supposed to be absolutely fireproof, being constructed of steel and cement in its entirety. To make its burning impossible, it burned to the ground. Remember, traditional steel-framed high-rises are steel and reinforced concrete. The steel bends away from the structure and the concrete holds up. Concrete was not used to support the World Trade Center towers. Most steel-frame buildings do survive fire, but some do not. Quote, I have never seen melted steel in a building fire, says retired New York Fire Deputy Chief Vincent Dunn, quote, but I've seen a lot of twisted, warped, bent, and sagging steel. What happens is the steel tries to expand at both ends, but when it can no longer expand, it sags, and the surrounding concrete cracks. Richard Gage accuses NIST of fraudulent computer modeling, claiming that the tests of steel beams sagged only 3 inches, and then NIST just plugged in a 42-inch sag figure to make their collapse model work. We can see the major steel sagging actually happens in regular fires. NIST's fire test resulted in a 3-inch sag, but the directly observable evidence from 9/11, like the inward bowing of perimeter columns, was derived accurately from photographs and video. Instead of adjusting the pulling forces upward until it resulted in a computer model collapse, NIST adjusted the pulling forces upward because in reality, the 42-inch figure of steel sagging matched the photographic evidence. Richard also stated that, quote, any 1,800-degree fire would have almost immediately been conducted through this 100,000-ton heat sink. Well, his heat sink is the entire steel structure of a 110-story building, which he claims all the heat almost immediately dissipated into, so the fires never got the steel very hot. That is incredibly high conductivity. Is this true? How fast does steel conduct heat away anyway? Copper is 8 times more conductive of heat than steel. And with real heat sinks, you have to use a thermal conducting paste to fill every microscopic gap. Consider a blacksmith heating a thin metal rod. He can heat one end of it to a glowing orange, while the other end is cool enough to hold with no more than working gloves. Remove the rod from the heat and it would take several minutes for the heat to equilibrate. And these crazy guys in the woods who were able to take a strong piece of railroad track, stoke it up with just a wood fire, made it hot enough to bend it around a tree with their bare hands. Steel does not conduct heat away from fires almost immediately, or these guys would have badly burned their hands. NIST studied this question in their report, and they show heat applied to representative individual columns with and without fireproofing. The time to permeate single pieces, not spreading out hundreds of feet, is several minutes to heat through. Gage's analysis of heat transfer comprises a sweeping statement based on no data, analysis, or experience. NIST's analysis of precisely the same scenario comprises extensive thermal modeling using known material properties, known structural dimensions, and proven numerical modeling software. The 1967 McCormick Place 30-minute fire collapse is, quote, significant because it illustrates the fact that steel-framed buildings can collapse as a result of exposure to fire. This is true for all types of construction materials, not only steel, wrote Robert Beranek, Associate Manager of UL's Fire Protection Division and a registered professional engineer. In my March 6th debate, I asked Richard, if steel-framed structures stay strong in a conventional fire, as an architect, why would you even consider bothering with including concrete reinforcement or fireproofing of the steel? His answer was disturbing. We do indeed put fireproofing in steel buildings, because it makes them indestructible in fires. Firefighters tell me virtually nothing is fireproof, not even concrete. The technical term for the spray-on fireproofing used at the World Trade Center instead of concrete is, quote, spray-applied fire-resistant material, a product called Blaze Shield. It helps allow enough time for occupant evacuation and to give firefighters enough time to safely extinguish the fire. Nothing can make a building indestructible in fires. A lot of what Richard Gage is trying to do is to make the World Trade Center building look as strong as possible. 80,000 tons of structural steel, fireproofing to make them indestructible in fires. Watch out for that word indestructible. When the Titanic sank, some people believed in its unsinkability too. And you can read books with long, detailed explanations about why the Titanic never sank at all. Very few scientists are willing to even look at such a book. When I began my research on 9/11, many scientists didn't even want to talk with me until I explained that I don't believe in the controlled demolition theory. They deeply resent someone who looks at thousands of hours of advanced mathematical calculation by a trained specialist and then gets mocked and distorted for their conclusions. They hate being told that they are part of a government conspiracy. They detest anyone who is unschooled in scientific method but hails their own theory as superior to the one arrived at after painstaking work. And they really, really resent being quoted out of context, with their words being twisted around to support a theory they consider unworthy of serious discussion. Richard Gage, Stephen Jones, David Ray Griffin, and their followers are disliked pretty intensely by a lot of these guys, and that is unfortunate. And that's a bridge that I'm trying to cross over here, or a gap that I'm trying to bring a little bit more together. To a non-scientist like me, Richard Gage's theories are compelling at first. All those architects and engineers who support him, very impressive and not to be written off. But the more I ask if Richard's assertions are true, the more obviously untrue I see them to be. The scientists who support the main theories of the NIST report are called frauds and criminals. That's beyond disrespectful. And 9/11 activists don't get much respect from the rest of the world either. So for the people who believe in controlled demolition, I am taking seriously every scientific assertion they are making and respectfully asking, is it true? On 9/11, 3 tall steel frame buildings collapsed for the first time. In 2008, the 4th tall steel frame building was brought down by fire, in much the same way as the Twin Towers. So far, I've offered up a total of 65 reasons, and counting, why they were destructible by the huge fires and the jet collisions that hit them, as almost any firefighter will tell you. In our next segment, we'll ask if gravity alone can bring down these towers at high speeds and nearly straight down once the collapse starts. Thank you for watching.